Good morning, everybody. I am Juliet. I am here for Streams. We operate through a website. So we've set up a little organization or company that really wants to support home educators who, when you choose to home educate, it can be quite daunting and quite challenging. And so we felt that it would be really great to set up a website where parents can go and can get kind of support from other home educators. So at the moment, if you go on the streams.education website, you will be able to read stories from home educators, people who are home educating, what they've learned, something great that happened, all different stories. It's really great. We're building up the collection. And the beauty of it is if you're a member, you can actually submit your own story and be an encouragement to somebody as well. And then we also have a review page where home educators can review resources for each other and then share that on the website. So if you want to know about a resource, the information is there. And then the other leg of what we're doing is maybe we're a table with four legs, right, Joe? And so is the webinars. And once a month, we do a webinar with a resource provider. And that's been really useful. We've interviewed Twinkle and we had Galileo on here, Collage, home educating app. And really, really interesting, because then you can go and hear straight from the horse's mouth all about the product and how it can benefit you. And then we also have another webinar every month with somebody who has a lot of experience in home education or is an expert on alternative education, such as Harriet today. And along with that, we also offer mentoring. So if you feel like you need a bit of support and help and you want some one-on-one coaching or mentoring as a home educator, you can also request that on our Streams website. And the website is streams.education. So that's a little bit about Streams. So we will be doing this regularly. And if you go and find us on Facebook or Instagram, or go and sign up as a member on the website, you'll get notifications of any new events. We also have a monthly newsletter that you can be advised of everything going on. And we have a blog every month as well. So there's something new to read every month. And we're also on Clubhouse, which is a social media app, which if you haven't heard about, you can go and check it out. So we're doing a couple of events a month on Clubhouse, just talking about home education. So we're very busy and really just trying to create a supportive community for home educators. But enough about Streams. I want to welcome Harriet. I'm going to just do some spotlighting so you guys can see who's who. Okay, so I want to welcome Harriet this morning. I've known Harriet for quite some time, and I have to say she's one of my favorite people in the home educating community. So Harriet, if I haven't told you that before, you're one of my favorites. So, and I love hearing what you've got to say. So Harriet was involved in some research on how children learn to read some years ago, which resulted in this book, Rethinking Learning to Read. And it's really worth going and having a look at that. And she learned a lot along the way. And I'm going to before we talk about the book, I'm going to ask Harriet to tell us a little bit about herself, who she is, and what her own experience is of teaching her own children.
Okay. Oh, well, thanks so much for having me again. And thank you very much for naming me as favourite person. That's very sweet of you. And it's always really nice. My children are grown up now and, gone off to do exciting things elsewhere. And it's just really nice to kind of keep that foot in the home education camp, because it's just such a great world. It's just such a great world, such a great thing to be part of. So we started home education. I hadn't really thought about it. I suppose I'd never kind of questioned the going to school narrative. And then it started with our elder daughter. And I was a new mum, and I was sort of, finding my feet in mumhood, and I've got a little one and another one on the way, and we lived on an estate, which was really nice. It had lots of young families on it, and all the kids went off to a nursery around the corner, and the nursery around the corner, it was a really nice nursery. It had kind of mumsy people there, and they had some pet rabbits and a garden and a computer, and and it looked a lovely homely place. And so it just seemed really natural that our elder daughter would go along with the other kids there. So put her name down and off she went, and she hated it. She just absolutely hated it. And I got lots of advice about, just persevere, she'll get used to it, she'll get used to it. But she didn't. And after a couple of months, I was thinking, well, actually, we don't need to be doing this, because, she was only little, she was under compulsory school age. So, there wasn't really any reason why she had to persevere with this when it was so hard for her. So we scrapped it, and she came home again, and she got a little sister by then, and another baby on the way, and it just felt right. It just started to feel really right for us all to be together, and that kind of sense of rightness, having had that experience of going to nursery and it not being a positive one, that kind of sense of rightness about it just made me feel, let's not disrupt this again. We've got the three of us here, we've got a really nice pattern of life, being together and doing all the great things that you do with little children, and really enjoying them, and enjoying the new baby. And so it kind of grew out of that, about let's not disrupt this thing again, let's nurture it, let's preserve it now. And it was through our elder daughter again that I really started asking questions about the learning to read thing, which opened up the research that I started doing on it. So shall I talk about learning to read now, Juliet, or don't want to preempt the questions?
Well, what I'd like to know is, so what would you say is like your standout best thing about home educating?
Yeah, it's so hard to say. I love the togetherness. I love being a family together. I love the fact that we didn't separate, especially in those kind of early years. Everything we did it together. We were like a team, we were like a real unit. I loved the freedom of it. I loved the fact that we could get up in the morning and see what the weather was doing, or see how we felt, or see what else was going on, and we could build our days around that. I loved the fun in it. And I loved that we could just you could just do things to make people happy, and you could find the happy way to do things. Whatever you did, you could make it a good experience. And I loved that. I really loved that. And I think one of the things that I found hardest, I suppose, about the children growing up and moving on and having their own lives is you can't solve their problems any longer. But I love that when you were a mum and you say, okay, we can find a way to do this together. I love that feeling.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you, Harriet. So I'm going to hand over to you a little now, just to talk about how you sort of came across the research, and how that, what you learned, and a little bit about what the book has focused on.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose if I'm saying about my favorite things, one of my favorite things as well was that kind of sense of discovery, and I used to really enjoy watching the children and the things that they got into, and sometimes the quite surprising things that they got into and that they found interesting, and it was lovely to be doing that alongside them. But what really blew my mind was when our elder daughter started reading. So I suppose I didn't really have any definite ideas about reading. For my own reading, I was obviously reading everything I could about home education, talking to everybody that I could about home education. And I remember in those early days coming across a couple of accounts of children who'd learned to read spontaneously, and they just blew my mind. I just thought, this must be amazing. People hadn't taught their children to read. They hadn't sat down with reading books. They hadn't sort of, gone through a process. But one day it had become apparent that their child could read. And I just thought those stories were just amazing. I also thought they were very distant from us and from our experiences, because, we were an ordinary family with ordinary children, and ordinary things were going to happen to us, not, these kind of really what I saw then as being sort of really off the page unusual. And our elder daughter, she was a lovely, lovely child to learn to home educate on, because she was interested in all the right things. She was interested in books. She was interested in writing, and she sort of went from kind of pretend letters to copying letters just spontaneously. She just liked to do it. And she liked to sit and turn the pages of a book and tell herself a story, and she loved being read to, and she could recognize her own name. So I kind of knew that she knew bits and pieces, and I was happy with her knowing those bits and pieces. I didn't feel, I kept thinking, well, we've got plenty of time. She's only 5, we've got plenty of time. And then what happened was my mum gave her a book. And we had a house full of books, and we regularly went off to the library and, picked books that we were going to read. And when we did that, it was always kind of with the unspoken assumption that they would pick the books, or we would pick the books together, but I would be the person that read aloud the books to them. But my mum gave our elder daughter a book and said to her, this is a book for you to read. And so that book came into the house with a slightly different message. And don't blame me, that's what she did. She took the book, was Dr Harriet's Hop on Pop. So it's a really simple phonics reader, but as far as I knew, she had never read anything apart from being able to recognize her own name. As far as I knew, she had never read anything at all before. And she took this book off and she read it. She didn't ask me to read it. She took it off, she read it by herself. She carried it around with her for weeks. Everywhere she went, Hop on Pop went too. And it wasn't until years later that she explained to me that she had the ambition of reading it from start to finish all in one go. And we kept interrupting her. And then she'd have to go back to the beginning again. So it was a kind of, I suppose it was a kind of self-imposed practice, but it was completely spontaneous. And I have to say, the whole experience of seeing that, really blew my mind. And there were kind of two things about it. And the first was that learning to read, being able to read, seemed and is so often presented to us as being a really complicated skill, and something that needs careful cultivation and teaching over a number of years for children to be able to do it to the, a required standard. And I kept thinking, how has she managed to do that without any help? Because she didn't ask any questions. She didn't, I'd never explained phonics to her or anything like that. She didn't ask any questions. She'd done it all by herself. So one part of my head was thinking, well, how has she managed that? How has she managed to learn something so apparently complicated without, proper input from somebody else? And the other thing that was sort of even more wild about it all was, how has that happened without me even noticing? Because, we were this together family, and I knew where she was and what she was doing, and who she was doing it with, and who she was doing it with was generally me, for all her waking hours. So how had this kind of seismic shift in her learning gone on, and I hadn't noticed when I'd been there? And I just couldn't, I just could not stop these questions tumbling around in my head. And that was the start of the reading research. And I had been lucky enough by then to meet Alan Thomas, and to start working with him on some work on informal learning. And it just felt like, a really natural move to expand that into learning to read. And of course, when I went out there and started talking to other people about their experiences, I found that what had happened to us was not so uncommon. It was not so off the page. It was not so unusual as I'd assumed that it was when I had read those early accounts of children learning spontaneously.
Yeah, I must say I had similar with some of my children. So they all learned in different ways. And by the time I've had 7 children, so by the time I got to like the younger ones, I kind of almost left them to it. And it brought incredible freedom. And part of our talking today is about, what does it look like to learn in freedom? So how did that empower you, having that knowledge about, your own children?
So I think the thing, particularly from the research, so I've got a few slides, so I'll just share a slide on this one, just to be a bit of focus. So when it came to thinking and talking to people about how their children had learnt to read, we were really lucky with the cohort, the sample that we got for the reading research. The sample covered 400 children, and we got families from all sorts of different shades of home education. So we had, philosophically inclined, pedagogically inclined home educators. We had religious home educators. We had home educators who had never intended to home educate, but had, reached a crisis point and had to take their children out of school. We had all sorts of different ideas about learning that ranged from very structured, right the way through to the families who were completely autonomous and who said, we didn't do anything about learning to read, we didn't even really think about it, right the way to the structured end of the scale, where people had very precise ideas about learning to read and how they wanted it to happen in their family. But those two extreme ends, they were, there weren't many people that fell into those two extreme ends. Everybody seemed to be somewhere in the middle between those two, because the exercising of the freedom was a bit more than, we're here and we do it like this. It was much more a negotiated, organic, kind of growing, worked out as we go along kind of freedom. And what was really interesting was that people who had started with structured ideas about learning to read very often moved into the middle. They'd say, I remember one mum said she was quite excited about the prospect of teaching her children to read, and she'd got all the material together, and she'd worked out how she wanted to do it. And then she found that actually didn't suit her children at all. And so she abandoned that and moved off and did other things with them. And I think it was that kind of freedom to have ideas, but then to rethink those ideas and to find different ways forward that made it seem very organic, very unique and individual pathways that people were forging, and that parents were doing that alongside their children. And similarly, from the other end of the scale, families who'd said, we were completely hands off, we thought it's better to leave the kids alone while they work this thing out for themselves, would then find that the child came to them and said, can you help me do this? And they would respond to that, whether that was actually, will you help me learn to read, or whether it was just, tell me what this says, because I need to know to get on with the next thing that I want to do. So that I think the freedom was really exercised across the whole range of negotiation and working things out. And also as well, the freedom of time. And I think that was crucially important, because sometimes when people feel that there isn't time, that there isn't time for them to move around within the freedom and pick things up and put things down and rest a while and then maybe go back to them, or maybe go somewhere else. When you feel that there is an imposition of, you have to be reading by the time you're 7, or you have to be reading by the time you're 10, that freedom dissipates under that pressure.
Yeah, yes,
I think that
that's totally true. Yeah.
Yeah, and that pressure is very cultural. It's not necessarily, keeping pace with the national curriculum or something that's laid out. I think that freedom is very cultural, that we have somehow taken on board that, that if children are not reading at a particular age, there's something wrong with them, there's something wrong with their family, it needs to be investigated. If you don't learn by a certain age, you'll never learn. All of those ideas, I think, are very thick in our society. And some parents talked about their role being to protect their children from those ideas, to protect their child's freedom, to do it in their own time and in their own way.
Yes, I often describe those pressures as fears.
Yeah.
So anything that's driven by fear is not going to be a good decision. Decisions that are driven by fear, and you have to break that down. You have to kind of look at, why am I doing this and who am I doing it for?
Yes.
So you just strip all of that away and then actually go and do your own research on what learning actually is, so that you can actually move forward with and be empowered to actually free your child up.
I think it can be very difficult for parents. I do honestly think that it can be very, very difficult. If you have got a 9 or 10-year-old who just doesn't seem interested in learning to read, it's very difficult to be sitting there. And we had this experience in our family. So I don't know if you had it as well, Juliet, and thinking, is this ever going to happen?
Yeah.
What's the point when I say I can't sit here and watch this any longer? I have to intervene. And interestingly enough, a lot of parents had got to that point where they felt I have to do something now. And they had started maybe on a teaching program or, reading with their child or trying to do something to push the process forward. And then they'd say, we tried it for a few weeks. Or maybe we tried it for a few months and then we could see, actually, this isn't going anywhere. It's just making us unhappy. It's just putting pressure on everybody. And it's, starting to impinge on our relationship. So they backed off again. And then, 6 months later or a year later or whatever, child was reading happily. And I think it's really important for people to know those stories and to understand those, that they're not the first people in that situation. And
I think my one son, who was slightly later than the others, he was closer to sort of 8, 9 when he really kind of started to get reading, because up till then it was all just all for show. Whatever I did was actually for show. It didn't really stick. And when he did learn to read, he was the one who was reading the big volumes of Lord of the Rings and that kind of thing. So it doesn't necessarily compute, makes follow that if they learn to read early, they'll be good readers.
I think we've got this. I've got a slide of some learning curves that I found. I haven't actually got what I consider to be our normal idea of the learning curve there, but we have this idea, don't we, that you start off at some point where the skill is meant to be easy and you progress through time, and that's the kind of a smooth upward curve, and that's the way that things are meant to happen, and that if they don't happen that way, there's something wrong. But actually, when I looked across the research at the different learning trajectories that people were describing had happened with their children, a lot of them didn't look like that at all. So, for example, the incremental incline, and this happened a lot. People would say that, the child had made a start, was maybe sort of reading a few basic words, or, had become interested in letters or whatever it was. And then they'd stop. That, their interest would fade away. They wouldn't make any more progress. They wouldn't be interested in going further with it. They weren't interested in being taught. And sometimes that kind of plateau could last a few weeks. And sometimes it could last for years. Very often people said that when the child picked up again, whatever stage, although they apparently hadn't been doing anything in terms of reading, they'd pick it up at a higher stage than they'd left it at, and then they would go off again. And that kind of, when I've talked about that plateau, a lot of people have recognized that in other learning as well, that we make progress to a point and then everything seems to stop, and and nothing seems to happen, and then at some stage later you take off again. The non-progressive one was a little bit like the way that I felt and described about our elder daughter, because there didn't seem to be anything at all happening. There wasn't any sort of outward sign that she was learning to read, and then all of a sudden she could, and it just sort of seemed to come from nowhere. And again, as Juliet says, a lot of the children who learned later, that was the case. They weren't reading, and then all of a sudden they could read, and some of them started at a remarkably high level of reading. And one girl, and this is a bit extreme, but the first book that she read was Lord of the Rings. But there were plenty of children who started reading with Harry Potter or Charlotte's Web, or something that we would not consider to be a beginner reader text. And the other thing that I think is really, well, there's two things, I suppose, that form the background to that. The first is that in home education, if a child is not reading, it does not impede the rest of their education in the way that it does in school. And I think this is partly where the enormous pressure that there is on children to begin reading early comes from. Because say you're in school and you're 7 and you're not reading at the required standard, gradually all the doors around you start closing. And if you leave primary school and you're not reading at the required standard. The fact is that your outlook in secondary school is pretty bleak. Children in school very rarely recover that ground, and the door to all the other subjects is access through literacy. So if you can't read the maths problems, if you can't read the geography text, if you can't read the history stories, that learning is cut off. That's just not true of home education. Children are learning all sorts of things, sometimes in great depth and great detail, although they weren't reading independently by themselves. And the other thing is, and I found this really interesting as well, is that the standard expectation is that children will learn to read very basic things, and then they will develop their reading to the point that they can go off and read a Harry Potter book, or a geography textbook, or whatever it is. And for home educated children, that often happened the other way around as well. So children were extensively read to and talked to, and had experiences of language and literature before they began independent reading. So they have all sorts of knowledge about things like vocabulary, genre, style, the uses of literacy, stories, narratives, conversations, arguments. They have a whole wealth of knowledge around all of those things, which they bring to reading when they start reading independently, instead of starting at a very, very simple level and then building up in order to acquire those things later. They already have them. And so a late reading child, say a child learning to read, or a young person learning to read in their teens, already has that behind them. And the reading slots into place in an already very developed field of knowledge and skill.
And would you say a lot of the way you witnessed this learning happening with reading, would you say that could be seen in other kinds of learning as well?
Yeah,
not necessarily just reading.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the reading is an illustrative example. I think it's a really strong illustrative example because reading is so central in our education. But yes, I think the things that happen in reading, and if you take the reading away from it, because reading is such a pressurized subject, like the incremental incline, lots of people can empathize with, well, I couldn't do it. And, and then learning to drive, lots of people, they have a go at it. It's really difficult. They can't somehow get it. They put it down, they go back to it later on. It's, oh, okay, no, this isn't so hard after all, and you move forward. And when you think about learning in other contexts, it doesn't seem so strange. And I think a lot of it is our very rigid, which is the opposite of freedom, that very rigid culture about learning to read. And once you start injecting some of the freedom back into it, it really does become a lot easier.
Well, I think for me, the issue is partly that there's this thought or this concept that in order to learn, you must be sitting in a certain kind of way at maybe at a table or a desk, and there should be somebody at the front telling you stuff, and that's how you learn. And I think when we break down and actually look at how learning happens, and I found the best way is to look at how do I learn as an adult, what works for me, because the school experience is actually in more of an artificial environment actually for learning. And so I've had to look at how do I learn as an adult and then say, okay, right, I can see how that would work for my children as well. So I could actually step back and allow them to learn for themselves. It's very, very in a more self-directed way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really saw that in lockdown, and I did do some research with parents who were pandemic schooling their children during lockdown. But there were things on the internet about all sorts of things about parents saying, I can't get him to sit down, I can't get him to do his worksheet. And there was lots of advice about, your children need a structure while they're off school. They need to get up at a sensible time. They need to get dressed, no sitting around in your pajamas. You need to be, in a specially designated workplace in the house at 9 o'clock in the morning, and that's the way to make it work. And there were some pictures of children in the garden and children, in a den who had refused to come out of the den and sit down, and parents struggling with these situations. Think, no, actually, go into the den, see what's happening in the den, join in the den, eventually you'll end up reading a book in the den. And I think one of the things that came out of that research around lockdown education was that parents really enjoyed the freedom. They really enjoyed saying, actually, you don't have to do this at 9 o'clock. You can do it at 10 o'clock, or 2:30 this afternoon, or heck, you can do it on Saturday, and we can use the time. We have this time, we can use it in our way. And I think that's an enormous thing in home education, that's and the power of that, the kind of the control and the autonomy of having freedom in time.
Yeah. Do you have any other slides to share, Harriet, or do you want to stop the screen share?
I don't mind. I'll stop the screen share then and see if anybody.
It'd be nice to see you again. I think properly.
Ask any questions or
yeah. Well, I think the thing is that with you're talking about children when they needed help, they asked for help, and I think that's quite a big part of learning in any subject as well. I will give an example. So I've got a son who's very fixated on space. My youngest, he really wants to go and work in space. He's 16 now, but that's driven his own desire to pursue certain exam subjects, to be able to because of what he wants. So he's motivated. And I like to talk about the 2 M's, maturity and motivation. So when they get to a certain age and they are motivated and they have the maturity to know, okay, well, these are the hoops I have to jump through.
Yeah.
That they're willing to tackle that and put the work in. So you kind of need those two to work hand in hand. And so he is doing physics and astronomy and that kind of thing. And these are subjects I know nothing about. So, he's asked for help with that and I've made sure he's got the help. But he's doing all the work and he's driving that process. And I think that for me, I've noticed that in the primary years, I cannot, like the role of play in learning is so vitally important. And yet we see that children they seem to have such a short childhood in this country because of the school system. They have very little free time in the day. And, so I feel like that foundational learning should mainly actually be happening through play. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I think we do have a very, very strong idea, again, sort of, through schooling, but culturally as well, that the way to learn something is for an expert to tell you how to do it. And how can a home educated child, say, learn astronomy if they don't have a parent who's an astronomer and can teach them astronomy? And again, I think it's a kind of a fundamental misunderstanding about learning. It can be incredibly useful to have an expert, but it's not necessary. It's certainly not the only way, and it's not necessarily the best way all the time. And the thing is, our children learn things all the time that we don't know and that we are not able to impart to them. And that's not just specialized knowledge in a subject like astronomy. It's, how to be their member of the family, if you like, how to I can remember my kids overhearing a conversation and saying, ask her when she comes in from the horses, because they knew when was a good time to get the right response out of me. That's not the kind of thing that you teach people. That's the kind of thing that they learn. And trivial though it may sound, it's very real in their lives. It's very meaningful in their lives to know those things. And children are actually really good at working things out, really good at finding ways into subjects and interests, and being critical thinkers about those things. And I think if we keep, John Holt said, didn't he, every time we intervene, we lose the opportunity to see what children can do by themselves. And I think that not intervening, and again, it came through strongly in the reading, there are multiple ways to do this. If you intervene, you overlay those multiple ways with your ideas. They might be great ideas, they might be really good ideas, but you take away the chance for children to find their own ways forward.
Yes, I just see Nikki has said, can we ask questions? I want to say, yes, absolutely. I would suggest putting your questions in the chat, and then towards the end, we'll come back to those. So please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. So The other thing is that I've now probably lost, I think I've lost the train of thought that I had before. Sorry, apologies, everybody. Oh, yes, it's like, do you think, so like with reading, I would say there's some things you can do foundationally to kind of maybe get your child understanding that reading would be a good thing to do. And perhaps with other subjects as well, there would be things that you might want to just expose them to, for them to get a clue that it's a good thing. Were there any things that you found just kind of helped with that at all?
So, I mean, one of the things that I found most interesting that came out of the reading research was that there did not appear to be that kind of common foundation for learning to read. There didn't seem to be one thing or a set of things that had to be in place, and that's very counter to the usual educational narrative, where, you know, the checklist of things that children need to be able to do. They need to be able to separate sounds in speech. They need to have left-right orientation. They need to know that pages turn in a particular way. They need to have so much time of attention span. They need to have particular eye movements. That checklist seems to get longer and longer every time you read one. None of that really seemed to explain the variety that went on amongst the home educated cohort. But I have come up with a kind of, it's not really a checklist, but I have come up with a few ideas that I think seemed to be common to the experiences of learning to read at home. The first one was people. Children needed people around them who were responsive to them and able to help them with the things that they wanted to do. They needed to have opportunities in their life. Those opportunities didn't need to be orientated towards learning to read. They just needed to be opportunities from which they could discover their own interests and find their own interests and their way forward into their own explorations of their own subjects, of their own things that they wanted to do, whether it was space or, you know, or animals or Pokemon or something on the computer or whatever it happened to be. They needed to have the people and the opportunities to develop those interests. The other things that they needed, I think, they needed love. They needed to, and when I say love, I don't mean they needed a loving family, because I'm kind of assuming that that's in place already, but they needed parents who loved reading, literature, and loved the idea of their children loving those things. So parents said over and over again, we want them to love reading. We want to nurture a love of reading. We want them to really enjoy reading. We want literature to open up a whole new world for them. So there were very positive feelings, expectations around it. And I think those feelings meant that parents wouldn't let their children have negative experiences of learning to read. If it was upsetting them, if it wasn't fun, if they weren't making progress, if they were fed up, if they wanted to go and do something else, then parents would say, okay, because that was part of nurturing the love of reading, was not allowing that to be overlaid with bad experiences. And the other thing that they needed, which I think arises from those things, is chance. I know a nice little story about a little boy learning to read that brings those things together. So this dad told me he had two boys, and he said they were both really into a children's singing group called the Wiggles. And they loved the Wiggles, they loved watching the videos, they loved dancing along to them, they loved singing along to them. He knew all the tunes by heart, he knew the words by heart. And one day he asked his dad to write the words of the songs out in big for him. So there's already, so we've got a little boy, he's had an opportunity to develop an interest in music and singing in this particular group. He's got people around him who will help him, so he can go to his dad and say, please, can you do this for me? And his dad says, yes, I will. So those things are in place. He's got a love of these songs and of the words that go with the songs and the whole thing. So his dad made him a folder with the words of the songs written down in it. And he already knew the words because he knew the songs by heart. So all he had to do was sit down with the folder and work out the one-to-one correlation. And this was his idea, you know, and I think that's where the chance element comes in. Nobody had said to those two little boys, you really need to get into the Wiggles and learn the words of their songs, because that's the way that you're going to learn to read. So, you know, we're going to have a test on it on Saturday, or, you know, nobody had seen this as something instrumental that was going anywhere. They had just seen it as, oh, they like these, you know, let's encourage them because they're having a good time. And that had led into reading so smoothly, so easily.
I've heard people talk about delight-directed learning or curiosity-led learning, and I think that describes it quite well, because you kind of need to be curious in the first place to actually be ready for new information. And I think one of the things I often encourage parents to do, if they are stressing about reading, I say the most important thing you do is read to your child, but read really good, lovely books, and use lots of voices, and just make it a lovely experience that they really enjoy, and they associate reading with that really positive feeling of being cozy on the sofa and that kind of thing.
Exactly, and you're nurturing that wider love. And even if they're not reading independently, you know, you are building up that really important background of knowledge about stories and vocabulary and how words work and how magical words can be. You are building up that behind, which they can take with them when they start reading independently. They will have that.
Yes. So we've got some questions, and I think it would be good to take them now as we're coming up like our last 15 minutes. So Joe has asked if you are currently researching anything now.
Yes, I am actually. I'm always researching something. So a survey that I set up with a co-researcher has just closed, and that's about relationships with local authorities. And that's, as we know, that is a very kind of hot topic at the moment. So I'm looking at that, and I'm also starting to develop a piece of research which is about teachers who home educate. And my thinking behind that is that we need some bridges. We need to be building some bridges between home educators and the wider world of education, and I suppose particularly schooling. And we're in a political situation now where the divisions seem to be becoming more and more difficult and entrenched. And so my idea with that research is that if we can talk to teachers who home educate, we can maybe start building some bridges between those two educational genres that I think we badly need.
Yes, I think so. I agree with you. And you know, we need many researchers actually in around home education, just to help increase that body of evidence.
If anybody is a teacher, and would like to be part of the research, do drop me a line. I'd be really thrilled to hear from you.
I certainly found that starting with more structured with my first children, and then as the years have gone on, and I realized that the stuff that I did that I thought was such fun and so exciting, they didn't remember it anyway. So it still didn't really, you know, if they are not driving that, if their own need to know is not driving it, it is fun. You can have lots of good times and all of that and create positive memories. But what you really want is for them to be learning the way we learn as adults. And I think that's what you've got to really challenge yourself on. Can I bring you another question here, Harriet?
Sure.
Okay, so Nikki has said she's got a difficult situation. Her 7-year-old son can read a little, but it's still early days for him. And he goes to Beavers, and his friends can all read fluently, and they make him feel, he feels stupid because he can't read at the same level, and he doesn't like it when his friends laugh. And she just wondered if you might have any suggestions for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really difficult situation, actually, and it's part of what we were talking about before, you know, is that there is this strong cultural idea. You can see that children have it as well, about, you know, when you need to be reading and what it means if you're not reading. I think it can be really difficult if you've got, you know, that kind of pressure on your child. And I remember being in home education groups with our children, and some children could read and some children couldn't, and you know, and it didn't matter, you know, that kind of expectation wasn't there. So I mean, I suppose there's two things really that you can do on there, and one is move to a better environment where you don't have, you know, those kind of
negative pressures.
Yeah, those sorts of negative pressures, exactly. But obviously you might not want to do that if Beavers is going well in other ways. You might want to keep going anyway, in which case I think, I'd have a chat with the child, depending on where they are in this situation, and say, look, people are different, and, you live a different life to those, and to those children, you do different things, you are a different person. And, it's not very kind or thoughtful of them to say those things about you. And they're going to have to learn one day that people are different from each other. It really does depend, I think, how robust your child is feeling as to which one of those you do. And again, thinking about what Juliet said earlier, I think parents have to trust themselves. You know your child best. You absolutely do. And when what you're doing is the right thing to do. Or when you're doing something, when you're sitting down with the reading books because you feel that you ought to. And I think you do have to trust yourself and trust your child. But I think it is one of the really sad things about our education system, that it shuts people down rather than opens people up.
Yeah.
And things like that. It's things like being teased or being told that, you're thick, or that kind of language that makes people close down. And I worked on an adult literacy scheme for a while, and when people got talking about it, more often than not, there was some kind of negative experience that had happened to them when they were at school. Everybody had laughed at them, or the teacher had said something really derogatory to them. And so after that, I'm not putting myself out there. I'm not going to put myself in that position. I would rather play truant, or just be the bad lad at the back than be the one who looks stupid.
The thing is, it's a marathon, not a sprint. In 5 years' time, nobody will know the difference, really.
They won't. And I've known that many cases of people who haven't learned to read or write until they're, maybe 12 or 13, going off to university at 18, and that kind of timeline that we are so fixated on, it really doesn't, it's an artifact. It is not the reality.
Yeah. Well, and Nikki, I hope that's helped a bit and just given you a bit of
I hope it
encouragement.
Yeah, I would go with your heart, Nikki. Honestly, I would go with your heart. And if you think this is a negative environment, let's go somewhere else and do something different.
Yeah, I think particularly if it's damaging, to him and to his psyche and that kind of thing, because even within school, we see people who are getting to the age of 40 or 50 years old still carrying damage from something somebody said to them when they were a child. And, we kind of have to protect that part of our children, really. I think it's really important. So we've got Crystal, who seems to be joining us from Australia, which is a welcome, Crystal. Lovely to have you join us. And she said, thank you so much for this research. She's a teacher in Australia, and she's been home educating for 4 years. There you go. Maybe she wants to take part in your research too.
Oh.
She's doing her doctoral research this year into how Australian home educators facilitate reading. Any thoughts or suggestions for research into this area?
Oh, well, I'm jealous. No, that's absolutely brilliant. Well done, Crystal. I mean, when I started, I meant to close the chat then. When I started researching the reading, I started out with the idea that I would have a questionnaire, and then I would go and interview people after that. And I opened up this questionnaire, and questionnaires are not very often. Questionnaires are sort of well, you've all had questionnaires. Sometimes you can't be bothered to fill them out, and and they don't ask the right questions, and or you say yes, I'll do that, and then you forget about it. And but the questionnaires that are sent out for the reading research, people really wanted to talk about reading. I mean, it was absolutely fantastic. People wrote me pages and pages. Some people stayed in touch. They'd send me updates and say, oh no, the situation's moved on now, and she's doing such and such now, and and kept in touch over it. And I think people really, really wanted to talk about their experiences. And I think we just can't have enough. I like to think that the research that I did can be a resource for families, who are, because when you're doing it for the first time, you know, you do have your doubts and your worries and your fears and think, you know, are we doing the right thing? And I think it's really helpful to be able to look at other people's stories and other people's trajectories. So I think the qualitative work on learning to read is really, really important. When it comes to dealing with policymakers, local authorities and so on, they're not so interested in the qualitative stuff. They like to have numbers that they can crunch, and it's very difficult to do that accurately in the UK. So I don't know if that might be a possibility for you, Crystal. But I think the main thing is to go and talk to people about their experiences and let their experiences rise to the top of the research.
That's great. Thanks, Harriet. I'm popping myself back in here because we're going to need to wind up. So I want to remind those, for those who didn't join us earlier, this is Harriet's book. So you can go and take a look at her book as well. And really, really helpful because she talks about the different cases and a lot of really great anecdotal stuff. Certainly in my own experience, I found that, first of all, you know, in terms of learning to read, is that, you know, I really didn't need to try so hard. There were little things I could do here and there to support. I could put, you know, little big cards up on the fridge saying fridge and one on the window saying window and whatever, which, you know, which I think for some children that works for them to realize, oh, that word means something. You know, it's not just meaningless scribbles, and then maybe they start making sense of it. But, you know, I found they all learn to read so easily eventually because when I stopped sort of pushing too hard, that I barely remember, you know, how it happened. And the same seems to have been for the other learning. So I've often thought if I was writing a report to the local authority, I don't know what I would write because I actually don't really know what we've done. Yet I have got children at university and in work, attending college and all of that. My second youngest is top of her class at college. And, you know, and yet, as I say, I could hardly tell you what we did because it's all of that foundational stuff that they were sort of sorting out for themselves. Their own foundations for learning were being built in a way that's almost like intangible. And so when they're ready, they just go. And one of the things I'd love people to get out of this talk today is just to really trust themselves and to have good instincts around what will work for them and take away that fear and that pressure that external things, bodies, family members, whatever, put on you. So Harriet, I want to just say thank you so much for your time today.
It's been such a pleasure to be here. And I think if there's a sort of like a final thing to say before we go, I think it's to say that we're still really learning about learning. And home educators are really, and Alan Thomas used to say this as well, and I was lucky enough to work with him, say, you know, this is a cutting edge. You know, we are learning things that we don't know about learning. And so I think it's really important that people trust themselves, parents trust themselves and trust their children that they are going to find the right way forward for their family. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. And I think I could talk with you all day actually on this because it's something that you and I both feel very passionately about. And, you know, we hope to hear more from Harriet. She's offered to write a blog for the Streams page as well. So you can go and sign up as a member on the Streams website and sign up for the newsletter so you can hear about more of these webinars because we will be doing them every month. Just thank you so much, Harriet. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning.
Yeah, absolutely.
We hope to see you at our next one.
Yes, I hope to be there.